Hey guys, we are here for part 2 of our collab with the No Priors podcast. So I'm here with Sarah Guo and Elad Gil, who are two of the most legendary investors in all of Silicon Valley. One way to start off is just to hear your journeys into tech, both as, founders, investors, and now running your own funds.
So I moved out here in 2001. I had perfectly bad timing because I moved out right as the internet bubble was collapsing. And I joined a company or a startup that was about 120 people. It grew to 150, and then it shrank to 12 people over 5 rounds of layoffs. So I got laid off in the third round. And at the time, what was happening was we just had this big bubble where tens of thousands of people had moved to the Bay Area. And then over the course of about a year, it felt like half the industry went under and everybody started leaving. And so it moved from like the Mission being super crowded, you couldn't park anywhere, the freeways down to the South Bay were super packed, to everything was just empty. And I remember at the time when I moved out, I just finished grad school, so I had no money, and I was,
Grad school twice, right?
I'm sorry?
Grad school twice?
No, I just did one grad school.
Okay. For whatever reason, I thought you had like a second PhD in something.
No, just one, and that was more than enough. In hindsight, it would have been better to graduate earlier.
And it was in the on the bio side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was in the bio side. So my background is math and biology, and I initially thought I was going to be an academic, and then I, decided that wasn't the right path, and so I decided to go into tech. And at the time, it felt to me like a recession was coming, or that things were very overstated, and so I just didn't spend any money when I first moved out here. So I, slept on the floor. I didn't have a bed. I was super excited when a friend of mine moved to the East Coast, and she gave me her futon mattress. I was like, oh my God, I have a mattress now. It's like a big deal. And I remember me and my friend Gokul Rajaram, who's now
legend. All you guys are
very
legends,
well-known guy.
It's crazy.
We used to go and buy like a loaf of bread every week, and a pack of cheese, and we just eat cheese sandwiches for every meal.
Oh my God!
Because I was trying to save money to pay off debt, right, from school. So it was a very frugal time. I think Silicon Valley used to be very frugal, like salaries and other things were very low. And again, the industry collapsed, so it was just kind of hard to find a job. So I just started volunteering for startups. I just said, hey, will you let me work for you? You don't need to pay me. I just want to gain experience. And through sort of a twist of events, I ended up meeting Sequoia, and I met Mike Moritz there. And he eventually, maybe a year or two later, introduced me into Google. And then that sort of kicked off the next phase of my career. But the first part of it was very kind of like, can I make it out here long enough to stick around? Because there's no jobs, no money, and like very little opportunity as everything was collapsing.
Man. 2002, 2003, yeah, like Web 1.0 basically had fallen apart.
Yeah, everything hollowed out. So, there was no startups, funding had dried up, venture firms were dying, like everything just kind of collapsed simultaneously.
But you ended up starting a company again, or actually you had not started a company yet. You had worked at another startup.
Yeah, I worked at a couple startups, and then I eventually ended up at Google, in part through this connection that I mentioned. And I think that was one big lesson for me, is just like, over the arc of your career, you end up working with the same people over and over again. And especially if you do a good job and you're forthright and you're ethical and you work hard and you try to be useful, those relationships really help you over the arc of 10, 20 years in different ways. And so at Google, a lot of those relationships then translated into other people. Because I joined Google, started the mobile team, but also worked on early AI systems on the ads targeting side. And a lot of the people that I worked with there ended up going off and starting a variety of different companies over time. You mentioned in our segment sort of Ev from Blogger. I think you mentioned him. And so I met Ev while I was at Google. I met a bunch of other people. Eventually, Twitter bought my first startup, in part due to that relationship or that know-how. Google at the time was a huge aggregation of a lot of the talent because nobody was hiring. And so they basically sucked in all the founders that were in the ecosystem whose startups had failed, which was most startups, right? So it was a very unique moment in time. And I think one piece of advice I'd give to people starting off now is, what is that next Google, or what is the next Stripe, or what is the next OpenAI, or maybe it's one of those companies still, but go to where there's aggregation of talent so that as you leave, you have these cohorts of people that for the rest of your career, you're going to end up working with.
I guess being at Google, at like the money-making part of Google is sort of, earlier in your career could be just an instant calling card that would like open doors.
Yeah, I think it was kind of the hot network of the day. There's a saying that you always turn into your biggest competitor eventually as a startup, right? You kind of age into it. And so at the time, Microsoft was considered this sort of sleepy, non-innovative company, and Google was the up-and-comer that was challenging everything. And then obviously 3 or 4 years later, Facebook sort of became the main talent aggregator And I think many years later it was Stripe, and then one could argue maybe now it's OpenAI or one of the other companies in the AI ecosystem. But going to one of those earlier in your career really matters because you just meet everybody, but then also the investors want to back you or fund you. You have insights into the market, what's actually important in terms of products, in terms of customers, in terms of all the rest of it. So
circle of life, I guess.
circle of life, yeah.
You either die a hero or you live long enough to become a villain.
Yeah.
That's why Elad has a beard now.
Yeah, I was actually
You're
going
in the
to do.
villain
I was
phase
going to do a
now.
Fu Manchu. So I was going to just start, cackling and stroking the beard. So that's 5 years from now.
Yeah.
Yeah. As I get isolated.
Yeah. Sarah, how about you?
Well, we were talking about ethos on the first part of this. And I think like product of environment. So my parents are both engineers and they're immigrants. They come here with $50, go to grad school here, go work at Bell Labs. And so I'm building a Linux computer like when I'm 9.
Sweet.
Right?
Yeah. Where were you?
I was born in Wisconsin, but Bell Labs is in New Jersey. And so I mentioned this because after the .com bubble, and this is also like bad story, good story, my family, if you're both at Alcatel-Lucent, parent of Bell Labs at the time, they tell you to take all your comp in equity. And that is like a good decision some of the time and a good bad decision some of the time.
Totally.
And the reaction that they had to like, oh no, I guess we're poor again is like, we'll go to startups, which is actually a very different reaction than most people have. But I describe it because I grew up around my parents building a tech company together that became a public company.
Oh, amazing.
And so that was like first attempt to like do engineering or product management, very weird thing in the networking infrastructure space. But to Elad's point, we were like in a neighborhood that was considered really bad. And so this is a story I like actually have never told publicly, but as a bunch of engineers, we're on the East Coast, we're working on networking infrastructure. We're like in the mid 2000s. And so it's not the good era of massive investment in networking infrastructure build out. Missed that by about a decade. Right. And you have a bunch of nerds. There's no marketers in the company, to your point about with love and respect for my parents as successful entrepreneurs, like there's not a communicator in the building yet, right? And so I'm 18 or 19 years old, and we come and pitch Silicon Valley investors. What the hell is your like teenage daughter doing here too? And so I started with like very little or kind of negative exposure to the investing ecosystem, but a fundamental interest in like startups. And so I like start a uninteresting failed consumer social company because you go to, if you're 18 or whatever, you kind of do the stuff that's around you. And the discovery was like both, the idea wasn't that good and I was in the wrong ecosystem. And so my whole goal was I was going to learn something about business and I need to like move to Silicon Valley because that's where the real game was at. And I'd also like in the course of like trying to do this thing, I was like, oh, like it's interesting that the people at Instagram or Snap or whatever it was at the time, they all figured out the things that I thought were like clever growth things, but earlier. And I was like, oh, my people are somewhere else.
Right.
And the people I can learn from are somewhere else. And the people who want to take risk are somewhere else. And so I came out and, San Francisco's expensive. I want to learn something about business. And you have like, grad school debt, right? And so I go and work for Goldman Sachs for a year. And to your point, you actually mentioned like rescuing people for Goldman Sachs. I was there for 365 days. It's like an amazing organization. It was not for me. And a tech
Choose a
person.
day.
What happened on day 365?
They paid me.
The bonus cycle.
Bonus time.
Yeah. I mean, actually, great crew there for the year, but I was never
course.
going to be there. But a great network. And what had happened was I met Reid Hoffman and Anil Basri during this period of time. I still had no interest in like going to investing or anything like that. But I was actually like many interviews down with Stripe, among other companies, like 30 some people at the time.
Right on.
And to your point of like go where the talent density is, I had no idea that it was going to be like what it is. But I had all the arrogance of being a young person who was like, well, if I'm not going to start another company yet, I have to work for somebody who's better than me. And you mean, Patrick and John, even at the time, you're like, oh, I might learn something here. And it's like, it looks like it's working, right? But there are many great entrepreneurs around Silicon Valley. And Anil, who'd been perhaps rescued from Morgan Stanley by Dave Duffield a long time ago, was like, I will rescue you from this. Come work at Workday.
Right on.
Workday was a bbigger company at the time. And I was like, I really want to do 0 to 1.
Right.
And so the idea was to go to Greylock to do 0 to 1 or like work with them and learn a little bit more about 0 to 1 for a while. And I ended up staying for a number of years. I think once you start anything or like you see a change that is happening that is as big as AI,
Absolutely.
then you want to work on that. Yeah.
Yeah. And some of it is like you were able to work with a great many I mean, people earlier in the AI revolution that now, I mean, those are pretty useful connects.
Yeah,
throughout.
absolutely. Yeah. And so I think one of the things that's, maybe in terms of advice for people is if you have an instinct about something and it like looks weird or doesn't look like it's working yet. My first investment at Greylock was a travel planning bot company called Hyper. Didn't work, but smart engineer and PM from Venmo and Google, now one's an investor and one works at DeepMind, right? But I think if you like start looking at this stuff in 2015, then by the time scaling transformers begins to work, like you have some intuition for it, right? And so like I would just say like focus on the thing you actually think is interesting because like maybe you're right if you're smart.
Flash forward a little bit, I guess I'm kind of curious, like what was the first investment that made you realize like, oh, this is what I want to do, or I'm good at this actually? I mean, it's kind of a hard one just because it takes some time, but it's always sort of almost a surprise to me. Like I started investing not really knowing if I'd be good. And then, many years later, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, like that worked out. So
I think there's a lot of lore that I disagree with around this stuff, which is I think you can actually tell if somebody's a good investor pretty fast. Particularly if they're doing early stage. I actually think if you're doing traditional Series A investing where you're making 1 or 2 investments a year, it takes a little bit longer. But I do think that there's this almost like myth in Silicon Valley that you need 5 years to figure out if somebody's good at it. And I think that's all false. So I think you can usually tell in a year or two if somebody has good instincts on this stuff, particularly angels. My chief of staff periodically will scrape all of the angel data across multiple sites and we'll just stack rank all the angels. And I think it's pretty clear who's good or bad pretty fast.
Yeah, I guess you just end up seeing the same people over and over again.
You can kind of see who's in good stuff and who's not.
Yeah. So what was like the first thing that got you hooked to, become like just basically trying to invest?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was very organic. I just started helping out different friends of mine because I was running a company.
Yeah.
And they were running companies at the same time. So they just started asking me if I would invest in their next round or whatever.
So just invest in that's one of the big rules in the Valley.
Invest in your smart friends.
Right.
Yeah.
Invest in your friends or just like people that are in the ecosystem that you're helping. Yeah. And so in my first like 5 or 6 investments, I think I invested in Airbnb, Optimizely, which was a super hot company.
Yeah. Pete works with me now at YC. He's awesome.
Pete's awesome. He's so good. Dan too.
Dan's working on his $1 billion company now.
Yeah.
He's so good.
Limitless is renamed.
Good point. Yeah. I'm trying to remember who else. Miriam from Minted. She's great. So there was just like in the first 5, there was a couple that were pretty good. And I remember my girlfriend at the time, now wife, I think kind of doubted whether I was a good investor or not. And there was some article.
Too, so. She's like, really, you gonna do this?
Why are you wasting all your money on this stuff? And then there was some article that came out where it was like Ron Conway's favorite companies or something like that, where he kind of like listed, and it was all things I'd invested in. And so then she's like, oh, okay, like maybe
there's something here.
Yeah.
Can't be that bad.
Yeah.
I had like kind of gentle introduction to investing in that the first few years in venture, I was more working on company incubation, which was like better entry point where, you start with one person, you do a bunch of recruiting, you like see every customer with them. There's contact with reality, like we were talking about. And I was like, oh, I like this. This is okay. Helping companies is okay. But I think the company that made me think like, oh, like maybe like taste is all you need in people.
Interesting.
And like maybe you shouldn't confuse the issue too much was my former partner, John Lilly, and I, we did the Series A in Figma.
Amazing.
Right? And I like kind of grew up with Dylan because we were quite, we were both, I don't know, I guess a decade younger at the time. And the case for Figma was not, I mean, there are some things that like are just so clear and so true at that point in time, like the web is a platform. We're going to have like very rich applications in that platform. Design matters. Evan and Dylan are super talented. But we did all of these contortions to try to like talk about why the market was big enough and like explain why it was taking such a long time and like minimum viable scope and how we're going to make enough money. And like in the end, it didn't really matter, right? And so
just build stuff.
You built stuff, and they had a great plan. It's just ended up, most of the roadmap is actually very consistent with what even Dylan and Evan pitched like a decade ago. Just took a lot. It took a lot longer.
Interesting.
Yeah, in the 18-month original roadmap for like Figma at the Series A, they're like, oh, we're gonna have like basically like plug-in ecosystem. I think that took a good number of years longer. I think the learning for me was just like, okay, well maybe it is enough to just invest in the people that like feel very special with like a very long-term point of view and be early and like focus on that taste. And so that was probably the company where I'm like, oh, I could want to do that.
Yeah. Let's keep going. You're chasing the dragon on that feeling, which is, oh, wow, this is a company that actually is an enduring one that's going to be a part of like tech for, decades, really.
Yeah, it's really hard to tell early. I remember, you see something working and I think you don't really realize how big it can be. And if you go back a decade, there were no trillion-dollar companies, right? The biggest tech companies were maybe in the low hundreds of billions. I remember writing a blog post like 10 years ago or something, which was all around how hard is it to get to like a $5 billion market cap? Because there just weren't very many and the internet was a much smaller place. The number of people online was smaller. The time spent online was smaller. Everything was just more compressed. And the biggest companies in the world were like oil and gas and pharma, right? And so it's just a different era. And I remember one time I was talking with another now very well-known person, and I was an investor in the time in Stripe and Square, and he was an investor in Stripe. And Stripe at the time was worth 500 million and Square was worth about $1 billion. And we were trying to extrapolate how big these things could get. And at the time, a lot of the payments companies sold for $500 million or $1 billion, Authorize.net and all these old school things. And we were saying things like, wouldn't it be insane if Stripe ended up being worth like $3 billion and Square was like $5 billion and mind blown. Like, how can you imagine something that big and what an enormous outcome and how generational is that? And of course, we were both wrong by an order of magnitude, right?
Maybe a couple orders of magnitude now.
Yeah, no, good point.
on the way.
Yeah, good point. So you can kind of tell what's important, but it's hard to tell how important it's going to be or how big it's going to be. And I think that's also true of founders. You see people who are really, really smart, but there's a lot of really smart people where things didn't work out for them. And I think what the under-discussed part is who are all the brilliant people where it just didn't work and why? And when I used to meet people, I don't really do this anymore. I used to try and almost run a Monte Carlo simulation. Like if you met this person 1 million times, what's the expected outcome? And there are certain people where you're like, oh my God, this person, if you reran their life 1 million times, they do amazing shit most of the time.
Yeah.
And there's a small proportion of the time where it wouldn't work. And there's other people where you're like, that person got lucky. Right. And so it's really interesting.
Try to bet on the person who's going to, 999 million times out of 100 million. Yeah. It's just like, they're going to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess I have that on my brain now because, what are some of the characteristics do you think? Like when you look at a Dylan Field, like I didn't know him back then, but like knowing him better now, it's like the guy is just super earnest. Like he's not trying to be anything that he's not. And then
very polymathic too.
Yeah.
I think that's actually one sign is if somebody's reasonably polymathic, that's usually a very positive sign because it also means that their interests will broaden as they run a company and it will broaden into the commercial side, not just the technical side, like the learn business. And it's more just a proxy if somebody's interested in a wide variety of things. It doesn't have to be business at the time. It's more just like, are they interested in different types of technology? Do they know random facts about all sorts of things? And there aren't that many people like that. And there's lots of successful founders that aren't like that.
Yeah.
But I think in Dylan's case, that would be a commonality with some other founders who've done well.
I think that's right. I mean, one simple answer is like Dylan is very smart, right? Or, to use another example of somebody like we're all investors in, like Alex at Scale is very smart. That can be apparent even when somebody's 19 and doesn't have like lots on the pedigree yet. I think another thing that is, working with people as company helpers. Some people are really good at using help from other people, and then they like seek excellence in every dimension. And so Dylan himself would be first to say, he's like, well, I learned to be a leader, like a manager, because I'd been an intern before, right? Totally. That's a steep slope. But his instinct on like how to learn to do anything that Figma had to do was like a go find great. And, even with the companies that I work with, and I'm sure is true across like your portfolios, like some people are really good at using a connection and the ecosystem around them. And Dylan was really good at that, like without backers, and even better at it with backers. And like you'd have all these like amazing people who'd just be like, oh, they're floating around helping Dylan because they think he's special and going to succeed. And so I think that is one characteristic that is pretty useful. I think another, and like just thinking about somebody that I think we all know and have a lot of respect for, is like if you think about Dylan or Parker Conrad, like a lot of these people, you said earnest, they're much more intellectually honest.
Yes, intellectually honest is a good way to put it.
Than like many people might be. Like they know what is not working. They're not trying to rewrite the narrative. They might be like, I don't know, just more honest than you expect people to be. And I like that's something I'm very attracted to.
Yeah.
I think the one other trade I'll throw out there, and by the way, I'm somebody who believes that markets matter more than founders, and I say that as a
I've learned
founder.
that. Yeah, I've learned that.
So I think like the founding material is great, but really if you're in a bad market, it doesn't help you that much.
Well, but a good founder will find the good market.
Sometimes, I don't know. I feel like it depends on what you mean by good founder too, because there's 0 to 1, and can I find product market fit? And I do think some people just fall into it. I do think there is
Right
quite
place,
a bit of
right
luck.
time sometimes.
Yeah. And then there's people who actively seek it out, and some of them are good at that. Some of them aren't. And some people are incredible once it works of really taking advantage of it. And so if they fall into it and they're exceptional at that, that's amazing. But I think people under discussed for a long time just raw hard work and aggression and the willingness to just, put the startup above all else and work really hard and really go hardcore on things. And I think for a while, again, that was perceived as a very negative thing. And you need to find the right balance in terms of, how you think about ethics and other things and making sure you're doing things in an ethical manner. But fundamentally, I think just raw cussedness has been really undervalued for a couple of years, and it's coming back now. And you see that in a lot of AI founders. I actually think some of the best AI founders I know are really driven, really hard charging, really aggressive. That doesn't mean they aren't great to talk with and, great people. It just means that they prioritize certain things and work really hard against them.
There's a mission.
Yep.
Maybe to close out, I mean, you guys, on part 1, we talked about a lot of this from the YC perspective, as top investors, really in pretty much all of the top AI companies that I've seen, at the seed and the A, which is later than YC. What are you seeing? Like, how do you, what do you, what are you looking for, and or what are you seeing work when it comes to, like, we are still investing in the mice that are playing in, the OpenAI and Microsoft and Google and Meta's playground, like that, they are the elephants, and our founders and their startups are the mice. We're gonna, but the funny thing is, like, some of them are gonna grow up and then they will get to be elephants themselves. So we're really torturing this analogy, but like, what, how do you approach that right now?
Maybe I'll just give you some like random observations about like things that are working in
Definitely.
the market. To your point about like, well, it wasn't like SaaS just like wrappers on databases with workflow. I'm like, there's some wrappers out there with like the wrapping is very thick and the wrapping is very essential. I think the founders that have enough like curiosity to do time and motion and then product taste and understanding of what's going on at the frontier, and then sort of the longitudinal perspective to like predict what's going on in a really intellectually honest way.
Totally.
Like that's actually a very rare combination to find, and like we'll invest in that every time, and seems to work more often than not. I think the other point actually would just be, I'm on the board of this company called HeyGen. And to Elad's point, I'm like really, like, I think Joshua's so good. I think the like quality of people who are incredibly technical, really aggressive, and like have good product taste, and then like are also quite commercial. Like I feel like it's better than it's been in like the last decade.
That's amazing.
And from a cultural perspective, I think like trying to preserve that sort of velocity as companies like really hit it, because it's happening in some companies in AI, is like one of the things I'm most focused on, because I'm like, we can't give it up. Like this is the special thing. And so I hope we actually see more of these companies that are like 25 really hard charging people.
Yeah, I've lost all my predictive ability in AI. I think it's the market where the more I learn, the less I know.
Yeah.
And it's really unclear to me what's durable versus not. Like, I think a lot of things that are growing really fast are going to go away or get subsumed by competition. I also find it very strange that there's almost like mimetic concentration in certain areas of AI, and then other areas that are clear white space where you could build a company that are completely wide open. And so I find it a very confusing market right now. I've been lucky in terms of investing in a number of companies that have worked pretty well so far, but I find that my predictive capabilities are very limited in AI in particular. And I'm just like, what seems to be a really interesting market that's working? What do I think can build defensibility over time? Who do I think are great founders? And then there's broader themes. Like I've been looking a lot into, basically if you look at services, for example, SaaS in the US is like $500 billion a year spend. Services where I think headcount could be converted into AI products is about 5 trillion. And so if you just take 10% of headcount cost in certain industries, legal, accounting, sales, customer support, et cetera, and you were to convert those into 10% of that into SaaS spend, you've recreated all of SaaS.
Yeah.
So the transformation that's coming is massive. The application layer is going to be super interesting. Consumer is going to be super interesting. Infrastructure is going to be super interesting. Foundation models everybody's been focused on NLP. There's like 5 other types of foundation models to build in other areas besides language that I think are super interesting. So as I look up and down the stack, there's enormous transformation. And the other thing I've been getting involved with is AI-driven buyouts. So if you look at certain companies, a reasonable portion of their headcount and margin could probably be converted into AI or SaaS, or you could expand what people working at these companies could do. It doesn't have to be subtractive. It could be very additive or multiplicative.
Can you get the SaaS multiple? Because that would be pretty sweet.
Well, I think you're converting non-SaaS revenue into SaaS revenue because you're changing the margin structure pretty dramatically.
Yeah. At the end of the day, the multiple is a function of the gross margin.
Correct. Yeah. And so I just think there's these really big shifts coming. And so it's the biggest transformation I've seen in decades. And the real question is, how do you as a founder just point at the right things in there? And honestly, there's going to be some element of luck for some people. Some people are going to be very analytically correct and they'll nail it. But I just think it's such a fast changing market that every week is a year. And I think predictive capabilities are really hard.
What a time to be alive, honestly.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
It's great.
Yeah. I think ultimately it's, for us at YC, all we're trying to tell people is like, talk to users and ship product. And then it's just chop wood, carry water, same as it ever was.
Yeah, just build and ship and like talk to customers. That's all that matters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for doing the collab. This is
It's like crossover, like Marvel crossover or something.
All right, so go check out No Priors everywhere where you get your podcast right now. Go click subscribe right now. Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
so much.
Garry.
Great to see you.